Welcome to Naylor Glide Jewish Ministries, where we teach the Bible from a Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. This teaching is the first of a three-part series on the biblical calendar, and this teaching is part one, and it's titled Identifying the Biblical Calendar. So I want to start with a few questions. Is there such thing as a biblical calendar? If so, what can we learn from it? Number two, does the Bible provide details regarding days, weeks, months, and years? Number three, is the calendar which we are using today to keep track of days, weeks, months, and years a calendar which is in agreement with the Bible or not? So we want to find the answers to these questions as we go through this teaching. Now, there are many different types of calendars in the world. There are 86 different calendars listed on Wikipedia from various nations and people groups. And I'm sure there are many others, past and present calendars, which have been and are still being used. Many calendars are agricultural and are either based on the sun, meaning they're solar, or the moon, lunar, or some combination of the sun and moon. And we call that lunisolar. So today, as I'm recording this teaching, it is Tuesday, January 18th, 2022. So why is this day, the third day of the week, called Tuesday? How do we determine how many days are in a week? How do we determine the date for the day, month, and year? What is the source for the calendar which we use today? Discovering the source for the calendar that we use brings meaning to specific dates. Calendars connect us to history, culture, agriculture, and religious worship. What is the origin of the calendar we use today? The short answer to this question is that the international dating system, the calendar which we use today, is based on ancient Roman calendars. Now, just to make note here that the original Roman calendar had an 8-day week, as we see in the picture on the screen. Emperor Constantine officially changed the Roman calendar from an 8-day calendar, an 8-day-a-week calendar, to a 7-day-a-week calendar in 321 AD as a result of Christianity and the Bible, the teachings in the Bible. So where do the names for the days of the week come from? We read the following explanation in the Almanac, quote, "The names originated with the ancient Romans who used Latin words for the sun, the moon, and the 5 known planets. Our English names also reflect the influence of the Anglo-Saxons and other Germanic peoples." Now, the following is an explanation of the origin for the names of the days of the week as we have them today, together with the meaning of each name, right? So this is the origin of the days of the week. Sunday comes from Sunandag, which means day of the sun, and it's a recognition of the ancient Roman sun god. Monday comes from Munandag, day of the moon, and Luna was an ancient Roman moon goddess. Tuesday is Tuisdag, Tuesday. Tui was an Anglo-Saxon god of war. In Roman culture, it was Mars Day. Mars was an ancient Roman god of war. So we see that overlap of the ancient Roman connection to the Anglo-Saxon connection. So basically the same god, and just kind of gave it a new name, but the same meaning. It's a pagan god, right? So Wednesday comes from Woodnesdag. Woden was the Anglo-Saxon king of the gods. In Roman culture, it was Mercury's day. Mercury was a messenger of the ancient Roman gods and a god of commerce. Thursday comes from Thor's dag, Thor's day. Thor was a Norse god of thunder, lightning, and storms. In Roman culture, it was Jupiter's day. Jupiter was the king of the ancient Roman gods and a god of sky and thunder. Friday comes from Frigedag, Frigga's day. Frigg was a Norse goddess of home, marriage, and fertility. In ancient Roman culture, it was Venus's day. Venus was the ancient Roman goddess of love. Saturday comes from Saturndag, Saturn's day. Saturn was an ancient Roman god of fun and feasting. So this is an explanation of the origin of the names we use today for the days of the week. So the days of the week as we have them today in English and other languages around the world come from the ancient Roman religion, which identifies them with various gods of the sun, moon, and planets. So it doesn't matter if we're using Latin or German or English, right? They're going back to this ancient pagan ritual of identifying certain gods. It is disappointing to see how innocently we have adopted pagan-based names for the days of the week through the calendar that we use today. What about the months of the year? The names of the months of the year have a similar foundation as the names for the days of the week. Without naming the entire 12 months, January has the following origin. Quote, named for the Roman god Janus or Janus, protector of gates and doorways. The names of the other months come from various sources, including names of gods, names of Roman emperors, names of seasons, and Latin numbers for the months. For example, September comes from the Latin word for seven, septem, a little more innocent. Now, we have identified the source for the modern names of the days of the week and for the months of the year. What is the name of the calendar that we use today? It is called the Gregorian calendar. This is the calendar we use on an international scale. And according to this calendar, it is the year 2022. And what is this based on? The reckoning of the current year as 2022 is based on the event of the birth or conception of the Messiah. So the first year of Messiah's life on earth. However, it is off by 5 to 6 years. We know that he was most likely born in 5 or 6 BC, which is interesting, right? We'll save that discussion for another time. So this system of counting years, starting with the life of the Messiah, was first introduced in the 6th century, as we read in the following statement. Quote, this dating system was devised in 525 by Dionysius Exiguus of Scythia Minor, but was not widely used until the 9th century. So this dating system is appropriately titled Anno Domini, Latin for the year of the Lord, or Anno Domini Nostri, which is the year of our Lord. Now, traditionally, we use the acronyms AD for Anno Domini and BC for before Christ to designate the counting of years. This has been widely replaced by CE for the Common Era and BCE before the Common Era to separate it from the Christ, from the Messiah. But it is worth noting that both sets of acronyms, AD-BC and CE-BCE, designate years before and after the life of the Messiah. So either way, it's in reference to his life, to Messiah's life. So how was the Gregorian calendar created? Where did it come from? The Gregorian calendar, which we use today, is based on the Julian calendar of 45 BC, which was a revised version of the Roman calendar of 713 BC. So both the Julian and Roman calendar, they're both Roman origins, just to mention that. We'll talk more about the Julian calendar. Now, the Gregorian calendar was decreed or authorized by Pope Gregory the 13th. On February 24th, 1582. That's why it's called the Gregorian calendar, because that Pope authorized it. Pope Gregory simply approved this updated calendar system, which is accredited to the Italian astronomer and physician Luigi Lelio, who died in 1576. The Julian calendar of 45 BC was a solar calendar based on the cycle of the Earth's yearly rotation around the sun, which at that time was calculated as 365.25 days, right? 365 and a quarter days. The Julian calendar was devised by Julius Caesar, a mathematician and astronomer who gave the world a fairly accurate calendar, which continued for nearly 2,000 years in one form or another. The Gregorian calendar started to replace it in 1582, but other countries still used it, right? Other nations still used the Julian calendar up until recently. So although the Julian calendar was fairly accurate and revolutionary for its time 2,000 years ago, it was not precise as documented in this quote. It was an error of 11 minutes, 14 seconds per year, which amounted to almost 1.5 days in 2 centuries and 7 days in 1,000 years. Therefore, there was a need to establish a more accurate calendar with a value of 365.242199 days. Besides needing to make the yearly calendar more accurate, the most important reason in the 16th century to update the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar was to have a proper rendering of the yearly observation of quote-unquote Easter, which is Resurrection Day, as all other Christian holy days are based on this day. Now, throughout this, I'm going to talk about Easter because that's how it is quoted, and that's how it is generally referred to in Christianity. However, it is more importantly the Resurrection Day. Now, Christian scholars have taken great pains to understand the biblical text to most accurately keep the correct yearly date for Easter based on the understanding of the biblical Passover. Now, the Julian calendar is a solar calendar based on the sun, which is the same system that the Gregorian calendar uses today. The biblical dating for Passover is based on the phases of the moon, the lunar calendar. The complicated nature of Passover being based on the lunar calendar made it extremely challenging for Christian theologians and astronomers to agree on the most precise way to date the yearly observation of Easter or Resurrection Day, as noted in the following statement. Quote, to determine precisely how the Resurrection and Easter Day should be dated, reference was made to the Gospels. But even as early as the 2nd century CE, difficulties had arisen because the synoptic Gospels, meaning Matthew, Mark, and Luke, appeared to give a different date from the Gospel according to John for the crucifixion. This difference led to controversy that was later exacerbated by another difficulty caused by the Jewish reckoning of a day from sunset to sunset. A final decision regarding the date of the yearly celebration of Easter or Resurrection Day was eventually ascertained by bridging the lunar and solar calendars in the following manner. Quote, the dating of Easter in the Gregorian calendar was based on the decision of the Western Church, which decreed that Easter should be celebrated on the Sunday immediately following the Paschal full moon that fell on or after the vernal equinox, which they took as March 21st. The church also ordered that if this full moon fell on a Sunday, the festival should be held 7 days later. This is still the method for determining the Christian observation of Easter each year until today. The Gregorian calendar is an extremely accurate yearly calendar based on the sun. The regular number of days in a solar year is 365 days, and they are divided into 12 months of either 30 or 31 days and 28 days for February, with a leap year every 4 years, giving it 366 days. There's also a centennial leap year if that year is divisible by 400, which forgoes the leap year, right? So, for example, the year 2000 was divisible by 400, and so there was no leap year that year, and that's the way of correcting the calendar. The Gregorian calendar is considered a Christian calendar because it is calculated from the life of the Messiah and was sanctioned by Pope Gregory XIII of the Catholic Church. Is the Gregorian calendar inspired by God because of its connection to the life of the Messiah? Something to think about. The Gregorian calendar is an extremely accurate means of keeping track of years based on the sun. However, it is lacking in its connection to the lunar cycle, with the exception of its attempt to coordinate it with the biblical observation of Passover in order to observe Easter. Is there such a thing as a biblical calendar? Is there anything in the Bible regarding the counting of days, weeks, months, and years? As is the case for most foundational truths, we first read about the source for a biblical calendar in the book of Genesis, as we read here in Genesis chapter 1, beginning in verse 14. Then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. So that's Genesis 1:14 and 19. So God created the sun, the moon, and the stars for signs, for seasons, for days, and for years. So that's how we see the foundational explanation in the Bible for the biblical calendar. So we read in Genesis how days and years were to be calculated by the sun and moon together. From the beginning, God set into motion this elaborate galactic system, including the sun, moon, and stars, as a means to properly understand times, seasons, and signs in the heavens from our perspective on earth. The word for seasons in Genesis 1:14 is the Hebrew word moedim, and we'll see the importance of that as we continue to go through this study. Just to mention, in Genesis 1:17, when it says seasons, that's the Hebrew word moedim. Moed is the singular. So how are we to calculate days, weeks, months, and years? Although God provided the system of the sun, moon, and stars as a way to understand time, seasons, and signs, even before man was created, there is no instruction manual for how to use this system of calculating time in days, months, and years until the days of Moses, as we read in the book of Exodus. Exodus 12, beginning in verse 1, Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, This month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves according to their fathers' households, a lamb for each household. Although the calculating of days, months, and years is previously recorded in the scriptures, for example, in Genesis 5-9, dealing with Noah, there's a counting of years with people's lives, there's the designation of months and days regarding the flood and when the ark landed here and there. So we see how they understood time in some way. The specific beginning of the year in reference to a particular month is first mentioned at the Passover. So the first month of the year was designated by the Lord during the month of Passover. We literally read in Hebrew of Exodus 12:2, we read the following, HaChodesh hazeh lechem rosh chodeshim rishon hu lechem lechodshei hashana. This month shall be the head of months for you. It is to be the first of the months of the year to you. The Passover was a defining time for the Israelites, and God himself set this particular month apart as the first month on the yearly calendar. Is there a name given for this particular month in the Bible? The answer is actually in the text in the next chapter in Exodus 13. Moses said to the people, Remember this day in which you went out from Egypt, from the house of slavery. For by a powerful hand the Lord brought you out from this place, and nothing leavened shall be eaten. On this day in the month of Aviv, you are about to go forth. Again, we also read in Deuteronomy 16, verse 1, Observe the month of Aviv and celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God. For in the month of Aviv, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. So the first month on the biblical calendar is called Aviv, or literally Ha-Aviv, and I'll explain the H there, the Ha, in a second. The Hebrew language periodically uses the letter He before a word in a general way when referring to a proper name, and I've listed a few scriptures in Judges chapter 6, especially when it uses a proper name. So there's also more to this name as we understand its meaning. Why is this month called Aviv? What does the word Aviv mean? The Hebrew word Aviv means green, budding, or grain coming into the ear. This picture illustrates it well. It has the meaning of new life bursting forth, especially of agriculture, of grain. We see how this word is used in the Bible in Exodus 9:31, where it says, The flax and the barley were struck down, for the barley was in the ear, and the flax was in bud. Right? So this phrase, in the ear, is the Hebrew word aviv, and means the barley, which was just starting to bring forth grain, the produce of the stalk. So in modern Hebrew, the word aviv is used for the season of spring. So the word Aviv communicates all of the following. Number one, the name of the first month on the biblical calendar, the month of Passover. Number two, it's an agricultural term describing new grain. And number three, it is a word used for spring in modern Hebrew. It has all those meanings. So what are the other names for the months of the year according to the Bible? So here is a list of the biblical names for the months of the year. The first month is Aviv. The second is the second month, then the third month, the fourth month, the fifth month, etc. Outside of the first month, Aviv, God only gave us the months according to their number. In the same manner, the days of the week are also numbered in the Bible, and we are never giving names for them, right? So in the Bible, it's Yom Rishon, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi. It's the first day, the second day, the third day. They're not given names. God did not give names to the other months of the year, and neither did he directly indicate, as far as we know, how many months there are to be in the year. We do read in the Bible that there are at least 12 months in the year, as seen here in the book of Esther. We read this in Esther 3:7, quote, "In the first month, which is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, Pur, that is the lot, was cast before Haman from day to day and from month to month until the 12th month, that is the month Adar." So here we see the first and the 12th month listed here in Esther 3:7. So although we read of 12 months, we do not see this explicitly defined or explained in the Bible. We just see it as given as something that occurred, right, in these months. Now, we will look more at the names of the months mentioned here in the next teaching. I said there's no other names given for the months, and I'll explain why we do have names here for the months. And we'll talk more about that in the next teaching. So God began to define the months of the year at the first Passover, and then continued to give Moses and the Israelites a more detailed calendar as they made their journey to the promised land, right? So that first month is the month of Passover. It's the month of Aviv. Now we read a comprehensive explanation of specific dates on the yearly, what I call the biblical calendar, which the Lord gave to Moses for the Israelites as recorded in Leviticus 23. We're just going to read the first 3 verses of Leviticus 23. Quote, "The Lord spoke again to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, the Lord's appointed times, which you shall proclaim as holy convocations, my appointed times are these. For 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwellings." So God began to unfold his calendar to the Israelites, first by giving them the month, but then by emphasizing the concept of a week. Work 6 days and rest on the 7th day, the Sabbath, right? A 7-day week. God continued in Leviticus 23 to assign various days and months throughout the year for the Israelites to keep and observe. And we're going to look at these in more detail in the next teaching. Now, the biblical calendar is fairly simple and straightforward, right? You have 7 days in a week. The first month was the month of Aviv, the month of Passover. So why did God see fit to establish a biblical calendar? Why was it important for the Lord to establish the month of Passover as the first month of the year and to reestablish the regular work week of 6 days with a weekly rest on the 7th day, the Sabbath day? God modeled the pattern of a 7-day week in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Was this not the common practice in the world from time past? Was this not being practiced in Egypt at that time when the Israelites were in Egypt? What was so significant about the event of the Exodus for the Israelites that God commanded them to keep his calendar as they entered into the promised land? I believe the establishing of a biblical calendar at that particular time for the children of Israel, as well as reestablishing a 7-day week, is more significant than most of us can imagine. It was revolutionary, life-giving, and prophetic. It is very important to understand the culture and yearly calendar of ancient Egypt in order to fully grasp the impact of a biblical calendar. So we're going to look at the Egyptian calendar. What kind of calendar was being used in Egypt regarding days, months, and years at the time of the Exodus? Ancient Egyptians relied on the sun and stars for their civil year while relying on the moon for their religious calendar. The ancient Egyptian calendar was comprised of 365 days, which was divided up in the following manner. 1 week equaled 10 days, 3 weeks equaled 1 month, 4 months was 1 season, 3 seasons and 5 holy days was 1 year. So 12 times 30 days, 12 months times 30 days is 360 days per year. The Egyptians then added 5 holy days to give them 365 days per year, with an occasional wandering year to make up for the lost day every 4 years, kind of like a leap year. The lifeline of Egypt was and is the Nile River, which flooded at the same time every year. This flooding cycle is the foundation of the ancient Egyptian calendar with its 3 seasons each year. It's very important to connect the Nile with the seasons and their calendar. So the 3 seasons of ancient Egypt are, number 1, Akhet, which is the flood season, Peret, which is the sowing season, and Shemu, which is the harvest season. And we see how those 3 seasons correlate roughly to the Gregorian calendar that we use today, right? June to October, October to February, and February to June. Now the star Sirius became vitally important to the Egyptians because of its connection to the timing of the annual flooding cycle in Egypt. The annual reappearing of the star Sirius in the Egyptian sky set the new year in the ancient civilization, as noted here. Quote, July 19th was the Egyptian New Year. This was the date that Sirius reappeared on the eastern horizon after a 70-day absence, and the date that the Nile began to flood. So important was this star that it literally became part of Egyptian worship. As we read here, quote, Sirius was associated with Isis, the mother goddess of the earth, who is part of the trinity of Egyptian mythology. The Greek pyramid of Giza is said to be built in alignment with Sirius. The ancient Egyptian calendar was marked by the shining star Sirius, whose yearly reappearing marked the flooding of the Nile River. Since the floodwater from the Nile River dictated when the people of Egypt could plant and harvest their crops, their ancient calendar revolved around this yearly marker connected to the rising of the star Sirius. At Passover, approximately 3,500 years ago, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob established a new calendar which he communicated to the Israelites as they began their exodus from Egypt to the promised land. So it's important to understand that the biblical calendar, with the first month being that month of Passover, was literally birthed out of Egypt as the Israelites left and went into the promised land. By establishing a new calendar, the Lord distinguished his people from the Egyptians and gave them a definitive starting point to the year, the month of Passover, the month of Aviv. Although the land of Egypt borders the land of Israel, the two nations are very different from each other in many ways, including their topography and the manner by which each land receives water. The land of Egypt depends on the yearly cycle of flooding by the Nile River as its water source. Egypt receives its water from the earth. The land of Egypt receives very little rainfall each year, approximately 50 millimeters or 2 inches per year. In fact, Egypt is considered to be the nation with the least annual rainfall in all of the world. You can see a diagram on the screen with this graph of several countries in North Africa and the Middle East, with Egypt being the receiving the lowest amount of yearly rain, yearly precipitation. The land of Israel, although located adjacent to Egypt, receives much more rain per year. On average, Jerusalem receives 555 millimeters or 22 inches of rain per year. This is 10 times greater than the average yearly rainfall in Egypt. And as you look on your screen for this precipitation map for Israel, Jerusalem is located in the center. And as you go north, you actually see how the rainfall increases to almost twice as much as Jerusalem receives, up to 1,000 millimeters. Now, Israel receives its water in a completely different manner from Egypt. Egypt receives its water from the earth, whereas the land of Israel receives its water from the heavens, the rain of heaven. The difference between the two lands is recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 11, as we read here. Quote, "For the land into which you are entering to possess it is not like the land of Egypt from which you came, where you used to sow your seed and water it with your foot like a vegetable garden. But the land into which you are about to cross to possess it, a land of hills and valleys, drinks water from the rain of heaven, a land for which the Lord your God cares. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it, from the beginning even to the end of the year." So that's Deuteronomy 11, verses 10 to 12. The Israelites exited Egypt and were entering into a new land, which the Lord cares for, and a new water source rains from heaven. Beyond the manner in which the land of Israel receives water from the heavens, the Israelites went from a land of slavery to a land of freedom. The physical change of leaving Egypt and entering into the promised land paralleled the spiritual focus of worshiping that which was created in Egypt to worshiping the Creator in the promised land, right? So the old religion of Egypt to the one religion of worshiping the Creator. The biblical calendar which God gave to the Israelites was not just a new method of keeping track of days, weeks, months, and years. It was a calendar to realign the people of God with the God of heaven and earth. It was a spiritual change. Again, we must ask the question, why did God begin his biblical calendar in Leviticus 23 with the definition of a week as 6 days with a day of rest on the seventh day? Why did God emphasize there in Leviticus 23 the 7-day week? The Israelites lived under the Egyptian calendar of a 10-day week for 400 years, and more than likely had no weekly day of rest while living as slaves in Egypt. That concept of a 7-day week with a weekly day of rest was foreign to them. The 7-day week is a constant reminder of creation and the Creator, Almighty God. The establishment of the biblical calendar at Passover, approximately 3,500 years ago, was so much more than giving the Israelites a new system of when to start counting months. And I wanted us to review the benefits of the biblical calendar as we have seen so far in the scriptures. God established the biblical calendar and the keeping track of years based on redemption from the land of Egypt starting at Passover. That was to be the beginning of months of the year. The Israelites went from being slaves in Egypt to being set free to worship the God of heaven and earth. Number 3, God reestablished a 7-day week. Work 6 days and rest on the seventh day. It's to remember who God is. Number 4, God reminded the Israelites to look to the heavens for their water source, not the earth. It was God himself who would give rains in their seasons and not some man-made deity in the stars. And lastly, God aligned his biblical calendar with the agricultural cycle in the promised land in a unique and prophetic manner. And we'll look more at this in the next teaching. The Gregorian calendar is an accurate means of counting years, but it has pagan roots and it ignores the lunar cycle. We need to understand it for what it is. The world uses the Gregorian calendar, and that's fine. We need to understand where it comes from and the meaning of the days of the week, the months of the year. The biblical calendar is God-centered and keeps us in harmony with our Creator, starting with Passover, the redemption at Passover. Now, this is the conclusion here. This is the main point. I want to just pause and just focus on what we really take away from the biblical calendar. If you've heard nothing up to this point in this half-an-hour teaching, I want you to get the main point. It is this: one of the main purposes of the biblical calendar is for humanity to understand our days, weeks, months, and years in light of who God is and what he has done for us, in order that we may worship him with our lives. It's very simple. But again, I want to repeat this statement because I think it's important. One of the main purposes of the biblical calendar is for humanity to understand our days, weeks, months, and years in light of who God is and what he has done for us, in order that we may worship him with our lives. This is the conclusion to part 1, identifying the biblical calendar. Hopefully it's clear as we went through this teaching to see how God has given us certain things to identify months and days and years. And we're going to go further in the next teaching. Here are some of the resources I've used for this teaching. Feel free to check them out, the different resources and links. And for the next teaching, we will focus on the specific days and months as found in Leviticus 23. So I want to encourage you to read that in preparation for the next teaching. I want to thank you for being part of this teaching. Please feel free to share these teachings with others. And if you are able to give a donation of any amount, we would greatly appreciate it so that we can continue to teach God's word from the Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. Thank you, and see you again next time.